black heart surgeon named Melissa Carter is pulled over on a rainy night while driving home, despite breaking no laws. Tension escalates when the officer draws his gun simply because she refuses to show fear. Melissa stays calm and reveals she's the wife of the National Security Advisor. And from that moment, everything changes. A twist from the past makes the situation far more dangerous than it first appeared. This wasn't just a traffic stop. It was a clash between power, ego, and justice. Rain had just started falling when Melissa Carter pulled out of the parking garage at St. Michael's Hospital. It was 8:15 p.m., and the Chicago sky was heavy with dark clouds. Raindrops tapped steadily against the windshield of her sleek white Tesla Model X. She'd just wrapped a grueling 16-hour heart surgery. Her body was exhausted, but her mind stayed sharp. Home was less than 2 miles away. The Lake Forest neighborhood lay quiet, wrapped in shadows and scattered porch lights. Mansions peeked out from behind manicured hedges, their windows glowing gold through the light mist. Melissa had lived here for nearly a decade. She knew every bend, every turn, and she also knew that being a black woman behind the wheel of a luxury car in a mostly white neighborhood still drew the wrong kind of attention. So when the red and blue lights lit up behind her, she wasn't surprised, but her chest still tightened. She exhaled, slowly pulling to the curb, hands steady on the steering wheel. No laws broken, no speeding, no missed signals, but experience had taught her that didn't always matter. She didn't look back right away. Instead, she calmly opened her phone's camera app, hit record, and placed it on the dashboard. A thin fog crept across her windshield as she glanced into the rearview mirror. The patrol car sat idle. No one had stepped out yet, but something in her gut shifted. Not fear, awareness. She didn't yet know that in just a few minutes, a gun would be pointed directly at her face. And from that moment on, neither her life nor the officers would ever be the same. Absolutely. Here's the American English translation of Part 2, written smoothly, with natural phrasing, preserved intensity, and U.S. measurements. The patrol car door creaked open. The soft squeal of the hinge cut through the damp evening air. Headlights bounced off the rain-slicked pavement as the officer stepped out, his shadow stretching long behind him. Melissa narrowed her eyes and watched him through the rearview mirror. The way he walked, slow, deliberate, wasn't the approach of someone responding to a traffic violation. It was the walk of someone asserting dominance. He looked to be in his late 40s, tall, broad-shouldered, his steps heavy, hair cropped short, face set like stone. Melissa knew the type, the kind of man who didn't need to raise his voice. His power came from the way he moved, the way he stared, the way his hand hovered near his belt. Authority wasn't requested, it was assumed. He stopped just behind her driver's side mirror, standing far enough back to force her to turn her head to see him clearly. "License and registration," he said flatly, without greeting, without explanation. No reason for the stop. Melissa kept her hands on the wheel, eyes forward. "Can you tell me why I was pulled over?" she asked, her voice calm, steady, not arrogant, not submissive. The officer blinked slowly, then leaned forward, eyes scanning her like a checklist. Small gold earrings, a dark blue hospital blouse, still faintly stained from a 16-hour surgery, an Apple Watch, a phone recording everything from the dashboard. "You failed to signal at the last turn," he said, eyes now fixed on the phone. Melissa blinked, giving a small nod, more to herself than to him. She knew she had used her turn signal. She'd driven this route 1,000 times. It was second nature. "All right," she said, "my license and registration are in my purse. I'm going to reach for them now." She spoke slowly and clearly, as if reading from a law textbook. But this man wasn't one for books. He didn't respond right away. His eyes stayed locked on her hands as if any movement might be a threat. Melissa could feel it. He wasn't just watching. He was waiting. Waiting for a reason. Then a small smirk tugged at his mouth. "Go ahead," he said, "but make it slow." A tight knot curled in her stomach. Not fear, restraint, anger she'd learned to bury. She'd been through this before, when someone else's discomfort turned her existence into suspicion. But this time was different. This time she was recording. This time she wasn't alone. She reached into her bag with deliberate care, pulled out her wallet, and handed over her license and registration through the slightly cracked window. The officer took them without looking. He just stood there, silent, watching. Melissa let the silence stretch between them, a quiet standoff. Not in words, not in motion, but a silent power test between two people on opposite sides of a line. Finally, the officer glanced down at her license. For the briefest moment, something in his expression shifted, a flicker, almost too fast to catch. But Melissa caught it. He'd seen her address. He knew where she lived. "You live around here?" he asked, tone softer now, but still laced with condescension. Melissa tilted her head slightly. About 2 miles from here. He clicked his tongue, as if something didn't sit right. So what brings you down this road? Melissa gave a dry chuckle, no real humor in it. I wasn't aware I needed a reason to drive through my own neighborhood. The words landed like a slap. His eyes darkened. He leaned in closer, placing one hand on the edge of her window frame, voice dropping. That attitude isn't helping you, ma'am. Melissa turned to meet his gaze directly, eyes unwavering. And what you're doing right now, that's not what I call doing your job. There it was, the crack in his composure. His jaw tightened. His breath shifted. The edges of his mouth twitched, not in amusement, but in something darker. A boundary had just been crossed. This wasn't about a turn signal anymore. This had become a confrontation between power and someone who refused to be powerless. The air inside the car was thickening like fog. Melissa kept her eyes on the officer standing outside her window, but she didn't need to stare long to read his body language. A furrowed brow, a sharp inhale, a slight clench in the jaw. Subtle signs, but as a surgeon trained to notice the smallest details, she recognized them all. He was either holding something back or struggling to stay in control. She didn't speak. She simply waited for him to return her documents, but he didn't. He stood there silent, as if he were waiting for her to make the first mistake. What do you do for a living? He asked suddenly, his tone shifting to something that sounded like forced small talk, the kind you'd hear while standing in line for coffee. Melissa didn't hesitate. I'm a heart surgeon, she said. He raised his eyebrows, clearly not expecting that answer. Really? You don't look like one. Simple words, but the meaning was clear. Don't look like one. Because she was a black woman. Because she was driving a Tesla worth over $100,000. Because she wasn't stammering, wasn't apologizing, wasn't afraid. Melissa pressed her lips together. She'd heard these kinds of comments before, wrapped in politeness, disguised as curiosity, but this time she didn't let it slide. And you, she replied calmly, don't look like someone following proper protocol. That did it. The smirk vanished. The fake friendliness dropped. His eyes sharpened like a blade. In that moment, she knew. He wasn't going to let this go. Then, without a word, the officer reached for her door handle. His fingers brushed the metal just as Melissa hit the lock button. A solid click echoed inside the car, loud and sharp like a gunshot in the silence. He stared at her, hand still on the handle. Open the door, now. Melissa didn't blink. On what grounds, officer? His face flushed. His jaw dropped slightly, then clenched. His left hand shifted toward his belt, toward the holstered weapon. Not quickly, not yet, but enough to send her pulse into overdrive. Do I really need to spell it out for you? He growled, voice low and menacing. Melissa didn't respond. She reached for her phone, still recording, and angled the screen toward him. I'm recording, she said, clear and steady, loud enough that anyone nearby might hear. He let out a dry, humorless laugh. You think that phone's gonna save you? He said, tilting his head, voice dripping with condescension. You know how many people have said that to me? She didn't answer. She simply held the phone higher, letting it capture his face clearly. Then, like the universe had perfect timing, a voice rang out from across the street. What the hell is he doing? A man, now maybe 25, stood on a porch, jeans and a hoodie, holding up his own phone, recording. The officer turned his head slightly. Melissa took the opportunity to glance around. Another witness, an older woman walking her dog, had stopped and was staring. The street was no longer empty. Attention was shifting, and all of it, every eye, every camera, was on him. Good, she thought. He wants control. Let the world watch him try to take it. Melissa raised her phone a bit higher, locked eyes with the officer. Badge number? She asked, louder this time. He didn't respond. His lips tightened. But for the first time, she saw hesitation. Barely noticeable, but it was there. A crack in the armor. And just like that, the atmosphere changed. This wasn't a conversation anymore. It wasn't even a power play. It was turning into something far more dangerous. He'd gone too far to turn back. And Melissa knew. If this escalated one step further, it wouldn't just be about a traffic stop. It would be about survival. The tension was thick enough to choke on. Melissa sat still, back straight, eyes locked on the officer. Her phone, still recording, remained in her hand, camera aimed directly at his face. A face now tight with frustration, flushed red with emotions he was clearly struggling to contain. She knew exactly what was happening. He felt his authority slipping. Not because of violence, not because of shouting, but because she refused to flinch, because she held her ground. People like him didn't know how to handle defiance. especially when it came in the form of calm, unapologetic confidence. They expected fear, submission, not this. "You think you're special?" he snapped, his fingers twitching near his belt. "No," Melissa replied, her voice steady. "I think I have the right to survive a traffic stop." That answer hit him like a slap. In the very next second, it all happened in slow motion. His eyes darkened, his hand dropped, and just like that, he drew his gun. The sound of leather and metal, sharp and sudden, cut through the rain. The matte black Glock was out, aimed directly at her face, no more than 3 feet away. A gasp echoed across the street. "He just pulled a gun on her," someone shouted, the young man filming from the porch. Melissa felt a chill crawl up her spine, but her body didn't react the way he likely expected. She didn't scream. She didn't duck. She didn't panic. She looked him dead in the eye. And what burned there wasn't fear. It was fury. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life," she said, her voice loud and clear, every word ringing like a courtroom verdict. Wind whipped down the quiet street, rustling wet leaves and stirring the thin mist that hung in the air. Porch lights flicked on. People stepped outside. Phones were already recording. Neighbors stared, silent, stunned. The officer didn't lower the gun. His hand shook just slightly, but the weapon remained trained on her. Melissa saw the truth behind his eyes. He wasn't defending anyone. He was defending his pride, and that pride had a finger on the trigger. Then came a voice, sharp, commanding, from behind him. "Officer Whitaker, stand down." He froze, eyes wide. A flicker of panic flashed across his face. A second figure moved fast into the light. Tall, in uniform, rank shining on her collar, Lieutenant Sarah Moore. Her voice cut through the tension like a blade. "I said, lower your weapon now." Whitaker turned, breathing hard, the gun still in his hand. His whole body was wound tight, like a spring about to snap. But all eyes were on him now, not just hers. The neighbors, the cameras, the entire street. Melissa didn't move. Her gaze held steady. For the first time, she saw real uncertainty in his face. Not because she was a threat, but because he realized he'd lost control. Whitaker clenched his jaw and slowly, reluctantly lowered the gun. Not holstered, just lowered. It hung awkwardly in his grip, like the weight of everything he'd just done. Lieutenant Moore stepped closer, voice low but firm. "Hand me the weapon. Now." He hesitated. Seconds dragged. Then, as if each movement took effort, he turned the gun and handed it over by the grip. Moore accepted it without a word, eyes locked on his. "You crossed the line," she said, "and tonight you're going to answer for it." Only then did Melissa exhale. A deep breath, like surfacing from underwater after being held down too long. She had never imagined a routine traffic stop would end with a gun in her face, but what scared her more than the weapon was the look in the man holding it. Not fear, not remorse, but resentment. The look of a man who wasn't afraid of being wrong, only afraid of being outmatched. And tonight, he was outmatched. The air remained thick with tension as Lieutenant Sarah Moore held the weapon now stripped from the officer's hands. Her face was tight with anger, jaw clenched, eyes burning holes into Whitaker, who now looked like a shell of the man he was just minutes ago, frozen, hands limp at his sides, his cheeks flushed, not from the cold, but from shame. "Ma'am, are you all right?" Sarah asked, her tone professional, but laced with genuine concern as she turned to Melissa. "I'm fine," Melissa replied firmly, eyes still locked on Whitaker. She wasn't finished yet. The street was buzzing. More neighbors had gathered. Phones were still raised, recording. People whispered, watched. Melissa knew this moment wouldn't vanish into the night like so many others had, not this time. She turned her gaze back to the disgraced officer, then spoke. Louder this time, making sure everyone could hear. "Before I leave, there's something you need to know." Whitaker didn't respond, but she could see his body tense, like he already knew whatever was coming wouldn't go down easy. Melissa took a deep breath. Her voice was steady. "My name is Dr. Melissa Carter. I'm the chief of cardiothoracic surgery at St. Michael's Hospital." She paused, just long enough to let it land. "And I'm married to David Carter, the national security advisor to the President of the United States." The reaction was instant, a collective gasp rippling through the crowd, a few people visibly startled. One older woman raised her hand to her mouth. Phones zoomed in, the street filled with a low hum of disbelief. Whitaker stood motionless. His eyes were blank, like his mind couldn't reconcile what he just heard with the reality he thought he controlled. Sarah turned sharply to him. "Did you know who she was?" He didn't speak, just swallowed hard, throat working around words that wouldn't come. Melissa never looked away, staring as though stripping him bare layer by layer, and then something unexpected. He mumbled, voice low, cracked. I know that name. Carter. I remember. He looked up, dazed. Back in 2015, I was investigated for excessive force during an arrest. The one who signed off on the inquiry. It was David Carter. He almost cost me my badge. A ripple of understanding moved through the crowd. Everything suddenly made sense. The name, the aggression, the rage that never quite fit the moment. Melissa wasn't surprised. She had guessed it the moment he saw the name David Carter flash across her screen. She saw the fear masked as anger, the calculation behind his silence. She knew this wasn't about a turn signal. So that's it, she said, each word calm but cutting. You didn't stop me for speeding or for failing to signal. You stopped me because I share the name Carter. Whitaker didn't deny it, couldn't. And in his silence, she saw it, a man unraveling. Sarah's voice was low and fierce now. You acted on personal bias, abused your power, drew your weapon on an unarmed civilian. You crossed every line we're sworn to uphold, Ryan. He didn't argue, didn't protest, just stood there, shoulders sinking, like a ship halfway sunk with no strength to rise again. Melissa turned to Sarah, her voice unwavering. I want to file a formal complaint, and I will cooperate with the federal investigation. Sarah nodded instantly. We'll begin that process tonight. Melissa stepped out of the vehicle, surrounded by silence. Dozens of eyes followed her, not in fear or pity, but in awe. The way people look when they realize they've just witnessed a turning point. Whitaker turned his back, unable to meet a single gaze, but the phones kept rolling, and this time no one was putting them away. By the next morning, the name Officer Ryan Whitaker was plastered across every major news outlet, but not in the way he'd once dreamed of. Not as a neighborhood hero or decorated officer. Instead, headlines read, Police Officer Pulls Gun on National Security Advisor's Wife During Unjustified Traffic Stop. The video from the scene, grainy through rain, Melissa's voice ringing out, You just made the biggest mistake of your life, had gone viral within hours. Hashtags like hashtag Justice for Melissa, hashtag Badge Not Bullet, and hashtag Power Check were trending nationwide on Twitter, TikTok, and Reddit. Inside the White House, David Carter stared at his phone in silence. The late-night call from Melissa had stirred something primal in him. Not the advisor, not the strategist, but the husband, the protector. He had told her, voice low and trembling, I'll handle the rest. And he had. Within 12 hours, the Department of Justice and the Office of Internal Affairs had launched a federal investigation into Officer Whitaker's conduct. Journalists began digging into his 20-year record, uncovering at least 7 prior complaints involving excessive force and racial bias during traffic stops, all of them dismissed due to lack of evidence. But this time, the evidence was everywhere. Evening news programs played clips of Melissa standing tall with a gun pointed at her face, calm, poised, unshaken, while Whitaker's hands trembled and his face turned crimson as reality set in. One CNN commentator said she didn't just survive a dangerous moment, she held her dignity, her intellect, and gave this country a masterclass in courage, not with fists, but with unshakable composure. As for Whitaker, that morning he sat alone in a temporary holding room at Chicago PD's Internal Affairs Division. His uniform had been taken, his badge, the symbol of his authority for 2 decades, sealed in an evidence bag. Outside the building, reporters gathered like sharks circling blood. His attorney requested to delay the public hearing, but deep down, Whitaker knew the damage was irreversible. He thought it would be another lesson, another moment of asserting control, a way to restore order. But he picked the wrong woman. And for the first time in his career, his mistake wouldn't be buried. She chose not to disappear. And in doing so, she didn't just protect herself. She lit a path for others. What Melissa hadn't told anyone was that, yes, she had been afraid, not of dying, but of being misrepresented, of being labeled angry, entitled, playing the power card. But the remarkable thing was, she didn't have to shout. The truth spoke loud enough on its own, and now that truth was echoing across the country. 3 days after the incident, Melissa sat on the edge of her bed, the golden light of sunset spilling through the curtains. Her phone glowed in her hand, hundreds of unread messages, interview requests, articles, podcast invites. But she didn't rush to respond. She just sat still, breathing slowly, feeling the steady rhythm in her chest, the same rhythm that, just days earlier, had almost been silenced by a gun drawn without reason. David stepped into the room, resting a gentle hand on her shoulder. You okay? He asked. She nodded, eyes still distant. I'm okay. but too many people don't make it home like I did. The room went quiet. For years, Melissa had lived by the unspoken rule, be excellent, stay low, don't draw attention. But she now knew silence wasn't enough to protect her from prejudice. And when the moment came, when she had to choose between shrinking and standing, she learned something deeper. Sometimes silence is complicity. She wasn't the first to have a gun pointed at her, but this time, the one holding it couldn't hide in the shadows because she hadn't looked away, because an entire community stood behind her, not just in words, but in truth, in action, in light. Melissa opened the video again, the moment she said, "You just made the biggest mistake of your life." She hadn't said it to provoke. She'd said it because it was true, not just for one man, but for a system that had grown too used to never being challenged. For the first time in days, Melissa smiled, not because it was over, but because she knew something had begun.